In this video, I'm going to be talking about the architecture of absence. So, looking at an existential and psychoanalytical perspective when it comes to the scapegoating journey through the void of the family. My name is Blake Anderson, and I'm a registered social worker and therapist here in Toronto, Ontario. And I have over 14 years of collective experience as a registered social worker and been doing 5 years as a therapist. My specialty is in helping those who've been on the receiving end of narcissistic abuse, particularly within the family unit. So I help the scapegoat and those who've been on the receiving end of this dynamic find greater meaning and ultimately address the complex trauma that they went through in their life. So stay tuned as I cover a topic in this area. The human subject from a young age relies on their family in terms of the presence of others. There's Winnicoff's notion of the good enough mother. So this is just the sense that the mother responds appropriately to the child and essentially is responding to the cues of the child. There's also the notion of a dead mother, the sense that there's this absence in the mother. They're not emotionally available and essentially are emotionally dead inside. And so you have the physical mother there, and even it could be seen as the family as well, but not having a genuine, sustaining emotional connection with your mom or your primary caregivers. And this can lead to a sense from a very young age as there's this essential absence in your life. And so I'm going to talk about the notion of that as well as the scapegoat role and how that shows up when you're in the receiving end of this dynamic within a narcissistic family. So I'm going to be pulling on some different psychologists as well as philosophers, and I'm going to again be focusing on existential therapy approach and also aspects of Carl Jung and others like object relationship theorists in terms of understanding this absence and what it means for the individual who's been on the receiving end of that in their family of origin. So I'm going to be talking about how one moves forward in terms of an existential aspect of their life when they have to essentially face being in opposition or no longer having that family of origin, or very much it being at a deficit in their life. So I'll be talking about how one faces that existentially and some common questions that likely will be coming up for their survivor of this form of abuse. So the phenomenology of absence, deconstructing the family defenses. Within the school of thought of phenomenology, that's a philosophy that understands what it means to be conscious and like human experience. So it's really about understanding that experience. And certainly we could take a very empirical, scientific approach to narcissism. And I think that's all well and good. But in terms of how you actually understand this in your own life, in terms of the experience, and then also how you grapple and integrate this impact that it's had on your life, I think it's very much important to consider the phenomenological. And so I'm going to be talking about what it means growing up in that absence in terms of that family experience from a young age. I just want to start off by some of the criticisms, like to play devil's advocate, because it's likely the case that in your own mind, in some sense, you have interjects of the family. So you probably tend to gaslight yourself, even when you've went on your journey and done a lot of research and known pretty much for certain that this is what occurred in your family. Like a lot of clients that I've had, there's usually a lack of diagnosis, particularly with the narcissist in the family. And because a lot of the times the person who is the truth teller is the scapegoat, and they've probably had a lot of gaslighting from the family and ways in which they've internalized their self-doubt, then there's a sense that they still have these interjects within themselves. So these common, like a devil advocate aspect to them, meaning basically that they have their own defenses to moving forward in their life in terms of understanding this truth of this absence that one had throughout their life. But it's perhaps the case that even if you went to your family and they might say, "What do you mean absence? We were present for you. We've always been here for you." They might say, "You're the one who walked away. Can't you see we're trying?" So these are common retorts that they would likely say with regards to your claim that there was an absence. Because the narcissist doesn't obviously want to admit fault, and there's the false self, right? They'll just double down. And then also the siblings and various, just the narcissistic family itself And because it's built around the narcissist typically, then it has a lot of defenses against any probing of the truth when it comes to this absence. So they will have these objections or retorts to your claim that there's this absence. And then even as well internally, you might have your own defenses or your own ways to gaslight yourself, or just to be ruminating and considering the ways in which it could not be true, maybe that you didn't have this absence, or that perhaps you're overthinking, or maybe you're the crazy one, or the one with narcissism. These are common aspects of when you go no contact and you're facing the truth of the family. I wanted to bring that up in terms of common claims or retorts that will be made from the family. I'll be exploring why you can respond to these retorts and understand how there was this absence. For the first claim, we've always been there for you, the illusion of physical presence. So the first defense of the narcissistic family is the conflation of physical proximity with psychic presence. The family argues that because they were physically present, occupying the same house, providing food, perhaps attending graduate ceremonies, they were there. The presence is a false presence. It's anchored in the false self of the narcissist. Psychoanalyst Andre Green, who is a French psychiatrist, and he articulated the seminal work on the dead mother complex. In 1997, he wrote about the dead mother. I came across this from Sam Vatkin. He mentions this concept in terms of understanding early childhood experiences, typically with a narcissistic mother. I believe he would also apply this to his dual mothership model. And so this is where I came across this term of the dead mother complex. And again, that's by the French, I believe he's a psychiatrist, Andre Green, and he wrote this in 1997. Basically, the dead mother is a parent who is physically alive, but psychically dead to the child. This is a parent often depleted by their own depression or narcissistic preoccupation. They withdraw from any emotional investment from the child. The child is left staring at a face that looks like a mother, but functions as a blank screen. He applied the term narcissistic, or rather a dead mother, had more to do with just an absence of a mother. And so he would describe the fact that it's could be depression, or doesn't necessarily mean just narcissism, but the way that Sam Vatkin uses this term, it's more applied, I believe, to his sense of narcissism, although he does mention it could be any aspect in terms of depression or a lack of emotional availability due to their own psychological and emotional mental health. In my conversation here, I'm just talking about it as the understanding within narcissism. This is basically growing up with a mother who was absent. And I would say to apply it from a dual mothership model, if both parents or one parent, let's say it's your father, there could also be this notion of there being like a dead mother within them, just in the sense that, again, applying the dual mothership model, there was an absence there. And so I guess you could say a dead father as well. I guess I'm just applying that in terms of this care that you were meant to receive, but you didn't, essentially. And physically, your needs were met, but there was a sense of not having a good enough mother. So your emotional needs and psychological needs were not met from a young age. And yet, when you try to raise this with the family or with your mom, typically there'll be defenses. And one of these main defenses is that we've always been there for you. So physically they have, maybe, but then emotionally and psychologically they haven't. This is to also understand in terms of going back to the blank screen. I've used this analogy or metaphor before in terms of the hall of mirrors. So the narcissist presence is constructed like a hall of mirrors. So it is designed to reflect the narcissist's own image back to themselves. So when the family claims we were here, they mean we were here performing the role of the good family for validation. The child was present only as an audience member or a prop in the performance. So absence is presence. For the scapegoat, the physical present becomes suffocating. Absence is presence, so it's not an empty room, it's a room filled with negative pressure that demands to be filled by the child's vitality. The parent is present only as a demand for service, status, and safety. The other claim that the family, or in some sense your own interject of your family in yourself, is the sense that you're the one who walked away. So this is again a projection of the scapegoat mechanism. The accusation that the survivor is the one who abandoned the family is a classic reversal of victim and offender, a mechanism known as projection identification. In reality, the child was abandoned decades prior when the parent failed to mirror the child's inner world, when they failed to offer secure functioning, mutuality, fairness. They abandoned the child emotionally. The child remained physically present, waiting for the parent to return from the narcissistic withdrawal. When the child finally initiated no contact or physical distance, they are merely externalizing a reality that was existed internally for years. They are making the physical situation match the psychic situation. The family attacks because it destroys their illusion of cohesion. By walking away, the scapegoat renders the absence visible. The family can no longer pretend the system is whole if the problem child is no longer there to contain the family shadow. So I've spoken about this in other videos, but the scapegoat provides an essential role for the emotional equilibrium of the family. And when that person leaves the family system in terms of the narcissistic family system, then there's a system anxiety that will often occur, and they'll try to pull the scapegoat back into place. And we'll do this in terms of hoovering, smear campaign. It could be also love bombing and idolization. I'll speak further about that cycle and how that occurs, but it's important to know that the scapegoat isn't abandoning the family. That's essentially what the family wants you to think. And from the outside in, it could definitely look that way. But certainly when you've been through this with your family for many years or decades, they did abandon you. You're just reflecting the psychic absence that was always there and making it a physical absence as well. So you could go back home and see your family, but there's also that sense that there's still that absence. The other claim the family might make is, can't you see that we're trying? The claim of trying is often the most insidious because it appeals to the survivor's empathy and an ethical orientation. So however, psychoanalytical theory compels us to ask, what are they trying to do? Trying to maintain supply. They're not trying to connect with the subjectivity of the survivor. They are trying to restore the homeostasis of the narcissistic system. You're an extension of them, like your arm. And if your arm's not working, they're trying to get the arm to work again. The evidence of absence. You might ask yourself, did they come see you? Was your mom and your dad present for you truly in your life? Some people live away from their family of origin. How often did they come see you? Did you often go see them? Did they attend your important events? When you were in an emergency or there's some crisis going on in your life and you reached out for support, were they sympathetic and empathetic towards you and provided support? It's a good way to take an inventory of how they were present for you. Genuine effort in a relationship involves curiosity about the other's interior world. In a narcissistic dynamic, the effort is usually performative, sending gifts, making a public post, or demanding guilt tripping. Lacks the mutuality described by Sam Vatkin in terms of what's needed for a secure attachment. The effort is actually a defense against the shame of being exposed as inadequate parents. So it's more about image management and performance, and it typically shows in the form of gifts and other superficial aspects. Maybe they send you a letter for the holidays or give you a phone call on a special occasion, but there's just a sense that they're doing that for optics and not actually for your well-being. And they don't really mirror or have a genuine curiosity or interest in your interior world. If you're having a relationship with someone, they have to have some curiosity and interest in your life and not just be about themselves or being superficial. Now I wanted to talk about the metaphysics of suffering, and I'm going to talk about Schopenhauer in terms of his understanding of the will, and also bring in the Eastern Buddhist concept of samsara, and just talk about aspects of this journey and how these philosophers or philosophy can help you consider your life. And so to understand why the survivor remains trapped in thinking about them and why the family dynamic feels an inescapable loop, we must turn to the metaphysics of suffering, specifically the more pessimistic philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer spoke about the will, and I wanted just to take from his seminal work, The World as Will and Representation. So, in that, he posits that the fundamental essence of the universe is a blind, irrational, and striving will to live. The will manifests in human beings as an endless desire, he would say. Suffering arises from the nature of the will. We strive and we are in pain because we lack. If we satisfy the desire, we fall into boredom, which is emptiness of existence becoming visible. The narcissist is pure will. The narcissist parent can be viewed as the embodiment of the raw, unmediated will. They are consumed by a bottomless hunger for narcissistic supply, admiration, control, status. Because the will is blind, the narcissist can never be filled. They consume their children in a futile attempt to satiate this internal void. Their image management is the will striving to assert its existence against the nothingness. Maybe that's a bit dark to say, and I guess I just like sometimes to take Schopenhauer. I enjoy his philosophy. And some might say that life isn't suffering and we can have happiness, or there's ways in which life isn't just about suffering. And I would imagine now, like when one can look at Schopenhauer's life and see how he there's some challenges obviously in his life and struggles. He lived way back when it was harder to have a level of conventional happiness that we have today. But at the same time, some of my philosophy and understanding of life is to embrace that life is suffering. Maybe it's my bias because I'm being a therapist and I'm hearing a lot of people's stories and life journeys. So I have a bias towards somewhat more the negative in terms of human nature or what people experience. I would say that even when one attains certain desires, there is this sense of suffering and boredom, some existential questions to consider. But I think it's important to understand this lens because I'm going to go a little bit more into narcissism and how this relates to this principle of life being suffering. So there, you could consider that there's a pendulum of life, pain, and boredom. So Schopenhauer famously described life as a swing between pain and boredom. In terms of the survivor's pendulum, in the narcissistic family, the survivor swings between the pain of abuse when the parent is active and intrusive, and then the boredom or neglect of the dead mother phase. So when the parent is withdrawn, happiness is negative. Schopenhauer argues that happiness is not a positive state, but merely a negation of pain. The observation that happiness is for the most part elusive and that most people aren't happy align perfectly with Schopenhauer's pessimism. The happy life is often an illusion or a temporary respite from the will, according to Schopenhauer. The defense of negativity. The narcissistic family enforces a tyranny of happiness, image management, while living in misery, essentially. The scapegoat, by acknowledging the suffering, is paradoxically the one closest to the truth. So you're essentially agreeing, at least to some part, with Schopenhauer that life can be also suffering or life is suffering. But the family, due to image management in terms of the false self, and Sam Vadkin speaks about this in some of his videos about how there can be this like virtual reality of the narcissist. So they want to convince you of this shared illusion. And if you are suffering your life, it could be the case and likely is that you in some sense participated or got trapped in this shared illusion in the sense that you in some sense wanted to escape maybe your own suffering. But in your healthier times or as you've grown and as a scapegoat and the truth teller, you've likely pointed out the misery or the suffering in the family. And yet, because of the family's conviction to the false self, they will double down and try to convince you that they have this happy, coherent, loving family. But you're just pointing out the negative. Schopenhauer would argue that the scapegoat's pessimism is a form of higher consciousness, a refusal to be deluded by the illusion of the happy family. Schopenhauer understood and borrowed a lot from Eastern traditions. Samsara is the understanding that the cycle of aimless drifting, suffering, and rebirth is the notion. Many of us understand with Buddhism or some Indian Eastern schools, there's the sense that you escape samsara by becoming enlightened. By becoming enlightened, you also save others. In terms of the wheel of suffering, samsara is driven by tanha. So that's craving and thirst. In the psychological realm, this mirrors Freud's repetition compulsion. Survivors caught in the wheel of samsara or the trauma bond. So they're basically The survivor is caught in the wheel of samsara, of the trauma bond. They return to the abuser or to thoughts of the abuser because of the craving to fix the past, to finally get the love they were denied. So trauma bonding is karma. The trauma bond is a psychological equivalent of karmic debt. The intermittent reinforcement, moments of kindness amidst abuse, keeps the survivor spinning on the wheel. The healing fantasy is the belief that one more rotation of the wheel will finally lead to nirvana, parental love. Yeah, I'm not to say that it's necessarily your karma, that you were part of this in your life, because I think that some more new age thinking might say that it's your fault necessarily that you're part of this family of origin. One could take some analysis to the way in which they came into this existence and were part of this family, can explore some of those ideas. But abuse isn't your fault. When you've continued to engage the family in a way that's unhealthy and allow this intermittent reinforcement to occur in your life, it is a sense that you're spinning the wheel of this narcissistic abuse cycle. Each time you're believing that one more rotation of the wheel will finally lead to the parental love that you've always been seeking. Schopenhauer, he would see the only escape from samsara is the denial of the will. So this does not mean suicide, which Schopenhauer viewed as foolish act of frustration, but rather ascetic, and the ascetic contemplation. So for the survivor, this translates to radical acceptance that the parent cannot provide what is needed. It is the cessation of the desire for the parent to be different. This is a stepping off the wheel. So this is essentially, he would say that it's the asceticism that is needed and asceticism contemplation. Schopenhauer could maybe be seen as an existentialist, but he's more the school of German thought and continental philosophy. In terms of the father of existentialism, Soren Kierkegaard is often seen as the lead or the beginning of existentialism. And so Soren Kierkegaard provided a cure through the dialect of the stages of existence or spheres of life. He had three essential stages. The ascetic stage is the sphere of immediacy, sensation, and the avoidance of boredom. The ascetic lives for the moment and views the world as a theater of their own amusement. So characteristics of this stage is hedonism, so the pursuit of pleasure and status, a lack of continuity. The ascetic has no cohesive self. There are a series of masks and moods. So boredom is the root of all evil for the narcissist in this stage of development because it forces self-reflection. They are motivated by status, service, and safety. The family image is paramount. The child is an ornament. Service, the child is valued only what they can do in terms of supply and not who they are. Safety is to do with the false self. You just have to confirm their false self. If you do that, you're seen as a safe person. And it's this forced harmony of the family is seen as what's safe and proper. The trap, as the family attempts to be safe to the narcissist or for a narcissist, is to be complicit in their lie. The family attempts to pull you down into their orbit. This is the ascetic stage. They mock the survivor's rich interior world because inwardness is a threat to their superficiality. That's part of this ascetic life. In terms of the second stage, according to Soren Kierkegaard, so he talked about the ethical stage. This is the scapegoat's burden. The ethical stage arises when the individual chooses to commit to the universal, so social norms, duty, and responsibility. So Kierkegaard exemplified this of the ethical is in terms of Judge William from the Either Or, who championed marriage, work, and civic duty. He argues that the person who lives ethically always has a way out, and that point is himself. The ethical person distinguishes between good and evil, contrasting with the ascetic, who distinguishes only between pleasant and unpleasant. The scapegoat as ethical. The survivor, often an empath or truth teller, typically resides within the ethical stage. So their orientation is reflecting on goodness, truth, and beauty often. And the scapegoat tries to fix the family by applying ethical rules, fairness, honesty, and accountability. However, the conflict is the survivor is applying ethical logic to the ascetic system. The narcissist does not care about goodness, they care about status. When the scapegoat says it's wrong to lie, the narcissist hears, "You are boring and annoying." Judge William warns that the ethical can become a trap if it relies too heavily on self-sufficiency. Furthermore, the universal society dictates that one must honor one's parent or one's parents. So thus the ethical stage can actually bind the survivor to the abusers through guilt and duty. So that's also a trap. You yourself as a scapegoat or a truth teller, the narcissistic family is still in the ascetic stage in terms of pursuing status, services, and safety in terms of narcissistic supply, and just be very much about image management and about what they can get from life. And they see you as an ornament or an extension of them, and essentially don't honor your internal world. But it's likely that you're part of this ethical stage and you've stood up to goodness, truth, and beauty and have pointed things out in the family. But you're applying the ethical to this ascetic stage that they're in, and they want to pull you back down into the ascetic in terms of being hedonistic and more concerned about status and pleasure. But essentially, you're taking a stand and being part of the ethical. But in order to do that, you had to discern between this duty to your family, blood is thicker than water, and you should always be loyal to your parents. But you have to discern and make a distinction between that, because obviously if a family's unhealthy and undermining of you and not treating you with a level of respect and dignity, then certainly it comes to a point where you do have to limit contact or set boundaries with your family. But again, because they're in the ascetic, they usually mock you having this rich inner world, and they also don't think that there's any universal binding principles that apply to them, essentially. And again, the third stage, according to Soren Kierkegaard, is the religious stage. And some people aren't religious, and that's fine if you don't want to consider this. I would say that it's definitely an important aspect or consideration. This is to understand the religious stage is the highest sphere. So it's accessible only through a leap of faith, according to Soren Kierkegaard. So you have to basically take a leap of faith. And this kind of goes back to Soren Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling. And I won't go too much into his philosophy or that book, but he analyzes the story of Abraham and Isaac. God commands Abraham to sacrifice his son. So the ethical view is that the killing of one's son is murder and is the ultimate sin against the universal. Abraham then is considered a monster. The religious view, though Abraham suspends the ethical obligation for a higher purpose, his absolute relationship with the divine. So this is a suspension of the ethical. And so that's maybe a bit of a jump for some people, but that's like an ancient story. And Soren Kierkegaard was looking at that story and analyzing it from these stages and giving his perspective on it. But how does this apply to the scapegoat? Essentially, for the survivor, this is the key to their liberation. So the survivor must sacrifice Isaac, which represents the family bond, the idolized parent, the hope of reconciliation. And they basically need to sacrifice that. And the suspension is to go no contact or to emotionally sever ties from the perspective of society and family. It looks like walking away or abandonment. The survivor must be willing to be judged unethical by the family and society in order to be truly of a higher command or of their own spirit or self. The knight of faith. So the survivor becomes a knight of faith. They walk alone, misunderstood by the universal, who say, "But it's your mother." They rely on the absurd strength of their own conviction, and their separation is necessary for their own spiritual survival. So essentially, you have to embrace your spiritual forefathers or aspects of the divine in terms of knowing that spirit is your back. This is to understand that you're no longer just part of the ethical, but you're part of the religious or spiritual stage. Again, it's to transcend and include these stages. So it's not to say that because you're religious, you deny the ethical or the physical world, but rather you are coming from a higher stage and you can still engage in life and enjoy pleasure and things like this. And you can also engage in the ethical, But according to Soren Kierkegaard, it was in order to be truly committed to the ethical, you have to actually have a religious or spiritual aspect. Some might say that you don't need that. You can be entirely rational, and that's fine. When a lot of my clients, when they've come face to face with tragedy or a malignant narcissist, it very much shakes them to the core. And it often is spirit or God that is very important for them. I would just say that religious themes often come up when it comes to tragedy or how to move forward in one's life. So Kierkegaard also talked about the repetition. So in his book from 1843, Kierkegaard defines repetition as recollection forwards. So the concept, true repetition is not doing the same thing over again. That is boredom, samsara. True repetition is the active willing of the self into the future. Now I want to talk about confronting the presence of yourself. In terms of the absence in your life, you've had this presence, you're present to this absence in your family. And now that you went maybe limit or no contact, the family is trying to give you the image or this illusion that they've always been present for you. And yet, when you're in the family and you've been in a relationship with them, there's always been this absence, but they're always trying to convince you that there's been this presence. And you've always been in the presence within the family of their absence. And yet, when you point it out, they try to convince you that actually, no, they're present and they've always been present. So it's just a way that kind of messes with your mind in some sense. But essentially, you're more present. And you might have a sibling that's been present with you, but often it's only been your presence witnessing this, in the sense that you're conscious and know what is right from wrong. And they know what's right from wrong, but they essentially just don't care. And again, it goes back to this distinction between the ascetic, the ethical, and the religious, that essentially they're just for services, for status, and for safety. In terms of the witness, in the absence of parental mirroring, the scapegoat developed a hyper-vigilant witnessing consciousness. They had to mother themselves, essentially. Well, according to Carl Jung's analysis, or from Susan Schwartz, she suggests that the dead mother leaves a void that can become a space for creativity. Because a survivor was not imprinted by a healthy mother, they are often less bound by convention. They are forced to forge a direct connection to the collective unconscious, so in terms of archetypes, or the divine. This explains the observation that survivors often turn to religious, spiritual, or existential topics. In terms of existential therapy and the practical application of existential therapy, it identifies four givens of existence: death, freedom, isolation, and meaninglessness. The narcissist family is a defense against these givens. The family demands enmeshment to avoid existential isolation. The survivor who leaves faces the terrifying truth: we are fundamentally alone. However, Yalom argues that only by accepting this isolation can we form mature, non-parasitic relationships. Freedom. The narcissist denies freedom. They are slaves to the false self. The survivor, by leaving, accepts the terrifying responsibility of freedom. They are the authors of their own lives. And the family provides a false meaning, the cult of the family. The survivor must construct their own meaning from the rubble. So this is to take logotherapy from Viktor Frankl, so finding meaning even in suffering. So in this video, I talked about how to judge the absence of the family now that we've limited or went no contact, and how do we move forward in our life from embracing a level of understanding of our own suffering and the suffering this has caused in our life, and how the families essentially denied the suffering within themselves and also took that out on us in terms of being a scapegoat. And I've, in this video, covered different aspects of this in terms of understanding the dead mother and this absence that was there from a very young age, and then how the family has various defenses and convinced you they had this presence. We can judge things by their fruits. So we judge it by the void we have in ourselves, likely because of what the parents and the family left us in some sense. We understand that maybe materially they have certain ways in which they create fruit in some sense. But when it comes to their generosity, mutuality, conscience, self-reflection, genuine empathy, caring, and authenticity, we can judge the fruits and understand that they're lacking. Often we're dealing with a lot of grief. And so we're dealing with the grief not only the loss of a person, but for the loss of the illusion of that person. The survivor's journey is to move from the ascetic seduction of the healing fantasy through the ethical guilt of walking away, and then into the religious courage of taking a leap of faith. It is a movement from samsara, so the cycle of suffering, to nirvana, this extinguishment of the false flame. So by acknowledging the absence, the survivor paradoxically makes room for true presence. Not the presence of the parent, but the presence of the self, the spirit, and the authentic life that awaits on the other side of the void. As Kierkegaard writes, the highest passion in a human being is faith. The survivor begins alone, but finally real. In this video, I talked about different stages one likely has to go through to accept this absence in life from a very young age from their family. And I talked about the dead mother and how that shows up as that absence. And then I also talked about embracing the religious stage in terms of fully accepting one's taking a leap of faith and having the strength to rely on something higher and above oneself. And then I just talked about different aspects you can deal with existential concerns or issues so that you can move forward more confidently and really address this in your life. So if you did like this video, please like and subscribe. Thanks and have a great day.